Today is the feast day in the Church of England of St. Francis of Assisi. The current Pope is named after St. Francis. There's an Anglican monastic order named after St. Francis. And there's even a girls' school in Letchworth named after St. Francis. But the original St. Francis, he lived about 800 years ago in a completely different world to us. And yet he is still so relevant for us living today. He's relevant because of his practice of a simple lifestyle. He's relevant because of his efforts at peacemaking. And he's relevant because of how he cared for creation. And we're going to reflect on those three things in a moment. But before we do that, let's just take a quick biographical tour of his life. So he was born in, no surprises, in Assisi, which is a town in central Italy, in early 1182, or maybe late 1181. No one's quite sure. His dad, he was a wealthy cloth merchant, and his mum was a French noblewoman. Now, initially he got named Giovanni while his dad was away in France on business. But when his dad got back from France, because he loved all things French, he renamed him Francesco, which means Frenchman. Now, at first, Francis wasn't very religious at all. He enjoyed partying and singing. Not that they're not religious in their own way, but religious, I guess, in the classical sense of the word, going to church a lot. He was a handsome guy, he was witty, he liked fine clothes, he loved to spend money. But he had no intention of following his dad into the cloth trade. He had these romantic notions of becoming a knight. And so, age 20, he joined the city's forces, the city of Assisi, in a battle against the neighbouring city of Perugia. And he was captured. He spent a year in jail. Then when he got out, he tried to join another army, but he had a strange vision and began to lose interest in the worldly life that he'd been living. Then one day he had another vision in a ruined countryside chapel where he was visiting, in which he believed that God was telling him to repair my house, which is in ruins. And so Francis started using his money to rebuild this chapel that he'd visited. And when he ran out of money, he actually stole cloth from his father to continue the rebuilding process, which perhaps wasn't the most Christian thing to do. But after his dad disowned him for stealing the cloth, he began to beg on the streets of Assisi for money to repair churches. And he also began to preach, and men came to join him in his life of poverty, of prayer and preaching. And it actually became a new monastic order, which obviously we know today as the Franciscans. At one point during his ministry, he travelled to the Holy Land to have a peacemaking dialogue with the Sultan of Egypt. And remember, this was during the Crusades, which were happening at that time. So it was a bold step to seek peace in that way. Francis spent a lot of his life on the move, but he also took time out in nature to pray. And he is well known as a lover of creation. He preached to the birds, and he wrote a poem known as the Canticle of Creation, in which he refers to various creatures as brother or sister. He died in 1226, and a couple of years later, in 1228, was declared a saint by the Roman Catholic Church. His life is a remarkable story, and it is worth us reflecting on today, especially around those three things that I identified at the beginning, that I think are as relevant today as ever: a simple lifestyle, peacemaking, and creation care. So let's start with simplicity of life. You know, we live in the most complex period ever in history. Never before has so much technology and so much choice been available to people. There was a time not that long ago, really, when everyone lived and worked within a couple of miles from their home. They would have had the same few staple foods day in and day out. People living in those times, I think they would find our modern world completely unrecognisable and overwhelmingly complicated. From television to computers, from supermarkets where you have an almost overwhelming array of choice in almost everything, to online ordering at the click of the button or a press of a screen. We can work from home, we can commute via bicycle, via car, via bus, via train, even via plane. Most of us, we have a world of information and, frankly, misinformation sitting in our pockets. Never before has life been so overwhelmingly complex. Francis lived in a simpler time, but even so, as a young man, he loved a rich and lavish lifestyle available to the wealthy. But he came to recognise and to realise that there is a futility in all that decadence, all that variety. He realised that there were better uses for wealth than self-indulgence. And so Francis committed himself to living a simple life. And I think in our context today, we would do well to learn from that. Whether it's resisting the temptation of all the spending opportunities that daily accost us on billboards and on screens, or whether it's trying to simplify our lives so that we're not in a constant state of stress. The wisdom of St. Francis on simplicity of life is for us today. He challenges us to think, can I live more simply for my own sake and also for the sake of others who are in need? And then the second thing Francis offers us today is a challenge to be peacemakers. Francis took the incredibly bold and courageous step of reaching out in peace to the Muslim world of his day in the midst of religious wars between Christendom and Islamic empires. And I think there's much in our modern world that needs a Franciscan touch of peace, whether that be in our interpersonal relationships, in our own community, or in the wider world. We need the courage of St. Francis to be peacemakers. And of course, that peace necessarily includes justice. As many protesters made clear during the Black Lives Matter protests, there's no justice, there's no peace. Because unless all people have the opportunity to live in equality and to live free from unjust acts and unjust structures, then that peace can only be a superficial peace. So we are called by Francis and by God to do what we can to establish right and just relationships between all human beings everywhere, whether that's in our own household or in the wider world, from community to globally. And lastly, Francis points us to the care of creation. Even if St. Francis wasn't an environmentalist in the modern sense of the word, we can still learn a lot from him and his love of creation. He spent time in nature and saw himself as intimately related to creation, calling its various parts brother or sister. And by addressing them as brother or sister, he brings them into the closeness and the intimacy of human relationship. He gives them a voice. God has given us such a beautiful world for our home, and we have that responsibility to use our intelligence and our creativity and our passion to care for our planet and to be in right relationship with every part of it. The voice of St. Francis from 800 years ago still calls out loudly to us today, calling us to live simply rather than get caught up in all the consumerism and the stuff of our age and the complexity that goes with that. Calling us to make peace with our neighbours, with our families, with our friends, with our enemies. And calling us to care for and delight in the created world that is our home and our responsibility. Amen.